tonight for our second meeting of the DC Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. Thank you too to all of you who made time to speak with me or with Karen or with John Paul about your experience in the first meeting. I was glad to get to speak to so many of you and was excited actually to try and replicate that over the next month with those I did not speak to personally. So after this meeting and before our September meeting, if you and I did not get to speak one-on-one, I'll be reaching out to schedule some time for that, just because I really valued those conversations with the folks I did get to talk to and look forward to making that happen for everyone. Tonight, we have a couple big items on our agenda. I think I spoke with folks about this in our one-on-ones. There were a lot of questions last time about our process, and so we'll spend some time on that. We'll dig in deep on the guiding principles and what those really are, what we mean them to be, and how we might start creating them together. We're going to dig in on your feedback on the standards, and I will say, wow, you had a great amount of feedback on the standards. Some of you wrote a few paragraphs in response to each question. Some of you wrote a few pages. Some of you wrote a few sentences, but all of you gave really thoughtful feedback on either the section of the standards you felt most comfortable with, whether that was grade band or topics. And some of you gave me the full landscape of feedback. So I have some highlights from that in tonight's presentation, but after the meeting, Alex will make available to all of you, if you don't have it already, access to the entirety of the feedback. So if you, like me, like to dig in deep on the data, you have everyone's comments and remarks that you can dig into at your leisure. And then we'll end tonight with some next steps before our next meeting as we begin to think about two things really deeply. One, what are these guiding principles going to be, and what is the universe of what's on your mind for those? And two, how are we going to engage the broader publics you are all part of? How will we engage other teachers in the city, parents in the city, other academics in giving us feedback on our guiding principles and starting to put in place a process for public feedback throughout this whole standards revision adventure? We have two objectives for tonight. The first is around making sure we all are clear on our process and our final deliverable. And the second is reviewing your feedback on the standards and really getting to dig in together in some small groups with examples of the guiding principles. You'll notice tonight we're on Zoom instead of WebEx, and part of the reason we made that shift is so we can use the breakout rooms feature and get you more time with one another to really talk in small groups, something we couldn't do on WebEx last time. I'm not going to go through introductions again, but as a reminder, these are the folks who are in the room. We did update the slide with folks' pronouns. And when you get into your small groups, we'll ask you to take just a moment and go around with your names again so that you know who you're speaking to. As we go through more meetings, hopefully you'll all start to recognize the folks in the room. And then as a final recap from last time, we talked about 5 norms, and these seemed to sit okay with folks last time. I want to give you another minute just to review them and see if you have any questions or any amendments to these norms tonight. If anyone has any suggestions or amendments, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat or use the raise your hand feature so that we know that folks have something they'd like to say. All right, then we'll go ahead and we'll work with these tonight. And if folks have amendments before the next meeting or later on in this meeting, you can feel free again to use the chat or raise your hand to let me know. So, biggest question folks had for me when we talked in between last meeting and this one was, what's the process? Where are we in the broader work of this standards revision as advisors? How does our work fit in with the larger work? In April, at the State Board working session, OSSE and the State Board Social Studies Standards Committee presented a process guideline, a set of guidelines. And I wanted to share those with all of you tonight with a couple of updates and notes that are particular for the advisory committee, just so we're clear on our process together and where it fits in the larger process of standards revision. So prior to us convening you all as a committee, OSSE and the state board were working together to talk through what this process would look like and to establish a plan. One thing I want to note that is different than we had hoped for was both State Board of Education and OSSE had hoped to request an FTE, a full-time equivalent, to work on the state social studies standards in our respective agencies. Because of the various fiscal cutbacks due to COVID, these were positions that we were unable to secure at this time. So everything on this slide is accurate except for that staffing piece. Both the state board and OSSE believe we can still do the work with the staff we have in place. Just be a little extra kind to all of our staff, because that means they're all working a little extra time to make this happen with existing staff time. I love them very much, and I'm very, very appreciative of all the work they've put in to make this happen. This is the meat of where we are now. This is where you all literally live in this work for the moment. Between July and December of this year, 2020, we are going to be working together as an advisory committee to develop guiding principles, to bring those to the public and get their input on them, to bring them back together and figure out what you all as an advisory committee want to bring to the State Board of Education for our adoption. Once the state board adopts your guiding principles, we'll transmit them to OSSE, and OSSE will take those to work with their technical writing committee on the writing standards. I explained this to the folks I spoke with, but my doctoral training is as a qualitative researcher. So my interest is in getting all the information I can and then winnowing it down to the best distillation of what we've come up with. So I'm thinking about our guiding principles in that way. Our final product is a list of guiding principles. I think we're going to start with a really big list and narrow them down along the way to the most important ones we want to make sure OSSE has in hand to get its writers going to work, that we will also use again to compare against revised standards to see if they meet what we asked for. So this process will be messy. Lots of ideas now, narrowing down over time via a process of discussion, consensus building, public input, and decision making. So want to be clear on the fact that I know this is messy, but I think it's also the best way for us to get all the ideas on the table and then decide which ideas rise to the top as the ones we want to transmit. I'm going to go through 2 more slides and then stop for questions. After the advisory committee transmits our guiding principles to OSSE, OSSE will go ahead and convene a technical committee. The technical committee are the folks who are actually going to sit at the table, put pen to paper, and put new standards in place, whether they are revisions of the existing ones or a total rewrite. This process will take place for the majority of 2021 and will really be a large break for the advisory committee. We'll probably convene once or twice in this time, but the bulk of the work here rests with OSSE, because OSSE will be working with the technical committee to write the standards. They'll bring drafts of the standards to the state board, and that's when we'll reconvene the advisory committee for your input and feedback on those. The last step of the process leading up to an approval of new standards is going to involve the state board, OSSE, the advisory committee, and members of the public, because you all will review and help get public comment on the revised standards. The technical committee will incorporate additional revisions. OSSE will incorporate those and bring back to the state board for our approval via resolution. And then those standards will be rolled out by OSSE to educators across the district. This is another important point for the advisory committee, because we're going to value your input on, did the guiding principles you set out at the beginning of the process reflect what the standards actually say? If not, what are the changes that are still needed to make them reflect that? If so, you know, are there any additional things that are on your mind at the time that you want to call attention to? That's the process. I'm going to stop and see if there are questions. You can put questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature. I can't see all of you, so I'd ask you not to raise your hand in the screen just because I can only see like 4 of you.
Hi, this is Karen Hopkins. I was wondering if the public comment period once the standards have been revised, will be like truly public, like anyone, or will it be limited to like DC community members?
That's a great question. So I think that public comment period will be a combined effort of the State Board and OSSE. Karen, I love your take on it. Obviously, there's standards for DC, so we want to make sure DC voices are represented. But is there a particular question sort of behind your question? Are there folks you would like to see engaged who go beyond district residents?
Human Rights Educators USA has a committee that actually has been submitting comments when we're able to, if there is like an opportunity for members of communities that aren't necessarily within the state to submit comments. So they have kind of a rich background in looking at various state standards, particularly looking at a human rights lens. So if possible, I'd like to reach out to them to give them an opportunity when that time comes, but understand if that's maybe not in the cards in terms of the plan.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful, actually. And when we convene in September, we're going to be talking about what we think public input ought to look like. So I think we'd love to have that included in your list of suggestions on what public comment should look like. Before I go on to other questions, folks from OSSE, I think I see both Justin and Siobhan on the call. Do you have any reactions to that?
No, I think that, I mean, we have worked collaboratively with Jess to come up with this sort of broad blueprint. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of planning to do. There's a lot of that we're thinking about and trying to execute. I think on public engagement, in the past, we have worked collaboratively with the state board around public engagement. We found when we did the ESSA task force that trying to leverage communities, like different organizations in DC, and sort of doing sort of a toolkit to help facilitate like different organizations to go and to have their own conversations around the ESSA plan, around the accountability system, around the report card was very helpful. And we were able to get deeper feedback in the community. So we would probably look at a strategy like that again. I think that we've gotten pretty good at engaging different communities and trying to like increase our bandwidth by working together. And we'll try to do that again. Thanks,
Justin. I think to that point, reminder on the ESSA task force is helpful because there are quite a few outside organizations that weighed in on different states' ESSA plans when they were in development. And I imagine we'll see the same thing with our standards. One more question for you, Justin. Sally in the chat says, for the long period that OSSE is working on standards, do you expect that they will be soliciting outside input? I'm going to come back to the previous slide here on the technical committee.
So the way that we've envisioned the technical committee is none of this is finalized yet. So any input that anyone has, recommendation of people. So the technical committee would be a mixture of practitioners, educators that are social studies teachers in the District of Columbia, also external partners, external stakeholders. Those could be national or state, or those could be national organizations or local organizations that have a particular vested interest in sort of the social studies and civics education. Those might be people that work on our technical committee. But we have not, we're still open to suggestions, and we'll make sure that we have a process that allows people the opportunity to sort of put their name forward to be on the technical committee.
Great, thanks, Justin. I don't see any hands up in the participant list, and I don't see any more comments in the chat, but I do want to see if there are any other questions on process. Sally also asked a question about guiding principles. Those are the next couple of slides, and I expect that there'll be lots of questions on guiding principles.
Sorry, this is Laura.
Hi, Laura.
I apologize if I somehow missed it. I guess I'm still a little confused on the relationship between the technical committee and this group. So I know like with ESSA, like kind of like now, like OSSE people would be in with us, kind of meeting regularly. We'd be getting updates on things they're working on to provide feedback. Would that be this? Would that be similar with the technical committee? Like a representative would be coming to us throughout the process, giving us periodic updates and opportunities for feedback to see if we agree that the alignment between the guiding principles and the technical committee is happening or whatever, just so we can kind of have progress updates.
So Justin, I'm happy to jump in here with my thoughts, but I'm also happy to let you lead off here.
To be honest, Laura, we have not gotten to that level of detail, but if you have suggestions of what you think might be helpful, we're certainly open to those.
Yeah, I think that's the right answer at this point. We have talked with Justin and the team at OSSE about there being a feedback loop so that the state advisory committee is giving their guiding principles and checking in that the rewrite of the standards is aligned with those. So that's as far as we've gotten on the feedback loop because the writing committee hasn't convened yet, but let's make that an additional piece of feedback for our September meeting, not just opportunities for engaging the public, but also opportunities that this committee would like to see for more detail on that feedback loop. Scott Abbott, do you want to ask your question aloud?
Sure. I spent so much time carefully wording it in the chat, but okay. No, I wanted to say, just with appreciation for the challenges that we have with the COVID crisis causing budget constraints, and again, appreciation for Jessica and Justin and everyone else who's been involved with this from OSSE and state board side. I really just want us to continue to look for funding opportunities to fund a full-time person to manage the work. Just having worked with a lot of state social studies specialists over the last 8 years, I'm not aware of any state that's revised their state standards without a full-time person to lead that work. And there's a lot of nuances to doing this in a social studies space that are different from doing it in other content areas. And again, that's not, nothing negative about the folks who are working on it. I think there's great people working on this project, but just if, for example, federal funding comes through for a stimulus, I wonder if that can be a priority to try to find that funding. There has never been a social studies position funded at the state level in DC. And I think if we're going to really commit to this work, we have to put some resources behind this as well.
Thanks for that, Scott. So I will speak to this just from the state board side. I do know that we are unable at this point to have an FTE. And John Paul, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that our budget cycle would allow for changes to be made at this point.
That's correct. Although I would certainly entertain any federal funding coming to the state board.
Hear to that. But as far as the way our funding cycle works, that is not an option. I don't know if there's any comment from Justin or Siobhan, but I do know that we all are hearing you loud and clear, Scott.
No, I don't believe that we're prepared to talk in depth about budget implications, but I think that we understand that this is a heavy lift. This is a lot of work and in a quick timeline, but we are certainly committed to the work and trying to figure out and use resources to the best of our ability, considering all of the various constraints that we have.
All right, one last call for any additional questions on process, knowing that there are two things that I'm now clear on that we want to ask for feedback on. One is thinking about public feedback beyond just DC members of the public, but also thinking about how we engage organizations in providing feedback on either our guiding principles or the draft revised standards. And then two, to Laura's good question about feedback from the advisory committee on the loop that will happen between the advisory committee's guiding principles and the revised, rewritten standards from the technical committee. What should the feedback loop there look like? What advice would you offer to us on that process? All right, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the big topic of our time together, which is the guiding principles. So what does our final product look like? We're calling these guiding principles, and we're saying that these are a set of guiding principles informed by public input that will be adopted by the state board and shared with OSSE to guide the writing of the new social studies standards. So what does that actually mean? What is a guiding principle? At the start of the current standards, there are some guiding philosophies, and there's both sort of a frontispiece set of paragraphs that describe the philosophies underpinning the standards, and then there's a series of bulleted points that come after that. Lots of you provided feedback in your Google form responses as to the content of those. These are not quite those. The way I'm envisioning the guiding principles is that they are statements that will be given to OSSE to give clear and actionable advice for standards writers on what those new standards should do or should not do. I expect that we're going to generate a really long list of principles, and then via internal discussion and public input, seek to narrow those down to somewhere between 15 and 20. I think more than that would be very hard for a set of writers to try to hew to, but I expect that it's going to be a process to get us from all the ideas we have down to what does this distill into. So I wanted to provide an example of my thinking and then get feedback from all of you, including questions, pushes, etc., to see if we're on the same page. I had shared with Jessica Rucker that I was intrigued by a piece of feedback she offered and was going to use this as an example tonight. So one piece of feedback she provided in her responses was that protest, which is enshrined in our nation's constitution, is an act of civic engagement as well as community organizing. However, protest is only explored in the standards she offers on page 67 during the 11th grade and seems to focus on one very narrow set of experiences. So as I was thinking about that piece of feedback, I thought about different ways we could craft that into a guiding principle, a way that we wanted standards writers to make changes in the standards to address this piece of feedback. And I came up with 3 of them. And part of this was during a conversation with Barbara Davidson. So I had brought to the conversation this idea that historical examples of protest and other forms of active civic engagement should be included throughout the K-12 standards. That's one way to take that piece of specific feedback about a given item missing from the standards, absent in places we want, and thinking about how we give feedback to writers to make sure that this is not the case in new standards. Barbara pushed me a little bit and said, that still feels pretty weedy. I think we need to come up another level to guiding principles. And she and I talked through the wording of these 2. Civic engagement should be addressed from both a historical and activist lens, or examples of content should be liberally sprinkled throughout the standards and examples, and make sure those examples relate to current content. So as I think about guiding principles, I think any of these 3 here could be an example of how we start to generate our initial list. But my hunch is that as we narrow them down, we're going to get to things that look more like the second 2 bullets than like the first one. Questions, reactions, thoughts. I'm going to pull up my participant window here so I can see hands getting raised. Laura, you want to go ahead and give voice to your comment, and then I'll come to Mr. Bethia?
Yeah, so I guess my thoughts are really just kind of like, the one, I could see how if you did a word search, you wouldn't find the word protest maybe that often in there. But considering in 10th grade, like probably 2% of my content is protest heavy, it's in there. But he's got to maybe dig through the subtext. A lot of the events that they mention are protests, right? Like in various forms, sometimes violent, but are forms of protest. But it could certainly be more explicit. But also that maybe, you know, would we have a chance, since we do have a lot of, I think, content specialists in here, when we have the guiding principles, could we provide, obviously we can't make the call, but like, you know, I could go through the 10th grade standards and point out everywhere where I want to see these principles put into practice and how I'd like to see them put into practice. That's just ideas to help OSSE along, you know? I'm sure others could come up with even more than I could, obviously, in all the content areas. So I don't know, just being able to put some of our specifics to good use, even though they're just, since they're guiding anyways, like it's not like we're saying that, you know, you're gonna have to hit everything that we put in there, but.
Yeah.
What we're talking about.
It's a good question. I don't want to try to answer it because I think it's going to keep circling in our discussion tonight, but I appreciate you raising it. And Scott, I like your notion of an addendum to the principles. I wonder how many documents we're thinking of forwarding, but Lamar, did you want to chime in? I saw a hand raise and then it went away.
Oh, I didn't have a hand raised.
Okay. Other thoughts, reactions to this concept of guiding principles? Did I help clarify? Is it as clear as mud now?
What happens if OSSE ignores them?
That I think is, I will speak to, that I think is part of our feedback loop, right? The goal here is that we're giving them, the writing committee is supposed to write to them. If we review the standards and they haven't written to them, that's feedback we have to give, to say, we gave these principles, we're looking for them in here, here are the places we still find them lacking. Barbara.
I think it would be helpful. I mean, since you gave me a little credit for having helped you to think about those guiding principles in the way, or alternative ways of thinking about them. I can't even say that I'm real clear in terms of what, like, why did you say that you suspect that the final two are going to be more at the elevation that we're going to want to present than the first one, for example? I just think it would be helpful for, I think, all of us to hear you, you know, think out loud a little bit about that.
Sure. Part of it, I think, is I imagine we're going to start with lots and lots of specific ideas, right? If your Google form responses are any indication, people have volumes of feedback about what is missing from the standards or how they would want to change the standards. But if we're aiming to get down to 15 or 20 distilled pieces of feedback, I think those pieces are not going to get more specific. I think they're going to become generalized from the pieces of specific feedback. So for instance, Laura points out that there are places in the 10th grade standards where protests appear, even if the word protest is not used. I imagine that people may have similar, in fact, you'll see when we go through the feedback reflections, lots of folks have concerns about language around racist and anti-racist aspects of the standards that is too neutral. And there are about 75 different ways people called out this effort at neutrality in language, which really masks white violence or white supremacy in the standards, but aims to be sort of neutral in a values sense by ascribing non-specific language. I think that it would be very hard for us to give OSSE 75 different ways we want the individual standards changed if we're going to keep to this 15 to 20 guiding principles. But a statement like language that is not value neutral with respect to the actions of white people committing violence against Black, Indigenous, people of color throughout the standards would be a more likely distillation of those 75 different ways people find trouble with the language. That's my thinking made plain, but I don't know that that's right. And I'm open to being told that there are other ways to think about this. Other hands, comments, questions, thoughts? So Daniel's suggesting a glossary, and Alex, I think I talked a little bit about specificity, but if there's another question you've got, I'd love to hear from you on that.
This is Karen Hopkins again. Wondering if some of the guiding principles would end up being kind of what we end up determining our themes would be that we want to see throughout all 12 grade levels, or if we would have like one guiding principle that says like these are the themes that should be throughout the document.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear others' reactions to that. whether you think that the guiding principles themselves would list the themes we want to see run as currents throughout the standards, or if we would simply say one guiding principle is the standard should illuminate key themes that students should be able to trace throughout their 12 years of study.
Well, I'll take a crack at suggesting that a guiding principle, at least as in terms of the way that I'm thinking about it, is more the latter, rather than to try to articulate what those themes would be. I have some thoughts about whether or not I think even that is appropriate, but that's a separate. I mean, I think that that's a very appropriate principle to try to come to terms with, whether or not we want to see these. It really reflects on sort of it's a principle. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a couple of principles, if we're going to target 15, that are going to talk about how they're organized, you know, and maybe even the degree to which they map to courses, for example, you know. So that seems to be the, at least for my present thinking, that's kind of the elevation that a principal would be at, rather than to prescribe what those would be.
I want to echo what Barbara said. As I was thinking about that, when I hear guiding principles, I'm thinking of, you know, what are broad philosophies that we all ascribe to that shape and influence the design of this? So I definitely see this idea of, like, we believe that history can be, or social studies, I should say, sorry, social studies can be organized and taught through a thematic lens. That seems like a guiding principle to me. You know, progress in technology or war and peace, which are examples of themes, I don't see those as guiding principles.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, or I guess just here's what I'm thinking. To me, the language should be as explicit and specific as possible. I understand that it's maybe easier to go broader because it can be more all-encompassing, but I feel like the broader it is, it's also easier to forget or to exclude certain events, certain people, certain aspects of history if you're not narrowing it down.
So Melanie, let me just ask a clarifying question. And I think as I hear you saying it, the specificity of language is essential in the standards.
Yes.
So we are not excluding. I think the question I have is, does that preclude the guiding principles from being broader as we give advice to the standards writers on how to write specific? Because I feel like that in of itself is a guiding principle, that the language should be as specific as possible.
So I guess my concern is if we make the guiding principles broad, how would the writers of the standards know how to tailor it?
I think
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think, I mean, part of the reason this makes my head hurt is all the good questions you were asking, which is, we have a charge to advise OSSE on how we want the standards to be rewritten. OSSE is charged with the writing of the standards, and we are then charged with ensuring that the newly written standards align to the advice we gave them. So we have to, I think, walk a pretty careful balance in broaden our guiding principles, asking the standards writers to be specific in their language, and then checking back that the language in the newly written standards aligns with what we asked those standards to include.
And we will be given the opportunity to do that?
Yeah, that's that feedback loop where we're giving advice.
Okay.
Alex O'Sullivan, I want to let you chime in because you said you had a question or comment.
Yeah, I was basically, like, when I was reading the standards, a lot of the problems I had in the standards was the specific wording. And I feel like the majority of the work we're doing with these guiding standards, I feel like it's extremely important that we make sure that the wording aspect is in terms of like the standards that are written are what we want them to be. And I think what Laura said about having broader like guiding principles than providing specific examples really will help, because I mean, I feel like if you make it too specific, then you may cut out something you didn't intentionally mean to. But my fear is that if it's too broad, then we just, the standards may go in a direction we had no like intention of sending them into. And I just think they're nitty gritty details or just like particular wording aspects that in the standards that it may rely on having like a good balance of specificity and broadness in the guiding principles. But I don't know, I just think it's important that we don't leave too much room for like interpretation.
So there seems to be broad support, and then I'm going to come to, forgive me, I just cut someone off who's now disappeared from my screen. So if they just raise their hand, I'll come to them next. I think there's strong support, it sounds like, for broad guiding principles with some specific examples. And when we go into our groups tonight, there's going to be a chance for folks to start to play that out a little bit. Because we, to Barbara's good comment here, we are not the writers of the standards. We are the advice givers. So we do have to walk that line really carefully, and that is our role. I don't see the hand raised, and the person did just disappear from my screen. Is it Sarah? Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I actually was going to jump in, so sorry about that.
I thought that was you, but you were on the screen and then you were gone.
All I did was inhale, so you really picked up on that social cue. So I think, building on what everyone's saying, something I'm thinking about, just bringing this back to elementary school, is what are the scaffolds we need to put in place so that these writers are going to be successful, right? And everyone's had fantastic thoughts around this, and something I go back to, and I think something that catalyzes all of us to be here is this sense of, justice and activism, which underscores protest, right? And yet that's not mentioned in the guiding principles. So I know I'm kind of free associating a little bit, but what I do not see in these guiding principles, these examples, anything that would really substantively shift the standards. So what then are the scaffolds we need to put in place that would shift that? So is it identifying, like categorizing these under themes, like teaching tolerance does? Like, does this fall under the activism, or does this fall under the justice theme? Does this fall under the identity theme? But identifying what we can put this in place to really kind of a little more clearly nudge this where we want to go, because I think every single one of us is here to promote social justice on some level and use social studies that way.
Thank you for that. I actually really like the way you put that, and I think it aligns with something Lamar put in the comments too. The notion of how do we scaffold what we're offering to give the writers what they need to do the job well. And Lamar talked about having exemplars, making it easier for students to hit the mark, and perhaps it will make it easier for the standards writers to hit the mark. We have a couple minutes left on our sort of timeline for this section. So I want to see, are there others who haven't spoken up yet, who are turning and thinking about what we've laid out here? Opinions on what you've heard so far around specificity, broadness versus exemplars?
Hey, this is Molly. Real quick, just my toddler's bringing me books to look at with her. I think that when I'm hearing a lot of people, I think the one thing I was thinking as I was reading through and trying to think about specificity versus broad is just the word guiding principle. Like whenever I hear that term, I think like broad, lofty things that we're aiming towards, not like nitty gritty specifics. And so I'm wondering if that's part of our struggle here and figuring out what this is supposed to be, is like that tension and just the term. And I don't really have a solution for that, which I really hate not having a solution. But I think I'm just kind of mulling over my brain, like how can we give OSSE specific information we want them to have while still kind of sitting in this lofty ideas of what we want the standards to be and we want kids to learn.
I think that names the tension really nicely, Molly. It is a tension between specifics and sort of lofty ideals, but I think it is a tension that we have not resolved as a group yet. And I'm inclined towards suggesting that we need to be broader in our guidance to OSSE, though I am moved by lots of the suggestions here around exemplars and examples to help scaffold that work for them. Sally, you look like you want to chime in.
I do. I guess maybe I realize it's a balance, but I can't imagine going through this exercise and not being able to articulate the themes that we think are important to be embedded and cut across the curriculum. So it may, I think one of the questions is whether there should be thematic strands that go K through 12. And that's a general statement, but speaking for myself, one of the things I'm concerned about and why I'm here is my interest in providing a global perspective and mindset and preparing kids to operate globally. To me, that is important K through 12. I wouldn't want to go through this exercise without putting that forward. And so I don't want to be so general that the writers kind of miss that. And I think these broad themes are general. So again, maybe it's the term that's being used as the generic. I think this will come through when people are putting their ideas together. But I, for one, really think it's important to identify the themes that we think need to be taught. I just don't want to be too general and miss out on that and have the writers have to guess.
Yep. So I wanna suggest something with cognizance of one of our norms being accepting non-closure. I don't want us to make a decision now. I want us to go into your feedback on the standards and give you time in the breakout groups to start to grapple with some of this and start to put words on a page as a group around some ideas about guiding principles. And then I want to reserve time at the end to come back to this discussion when you've all had a chance to grapple in smaller groups. If there's no objection, I'm going to move on to the feedback so that we can try that out and see how we go. I knew that norm would come in handy for things like this because there's no perfect answer here, and I'm delighted to be grappling with all of it with you. So in your feedback, as I noted at the start, some folks wrote paragraphs, some folks wrote sentences, some folks wrote pages. And so what follows on the next series of slides is not the totality of your feedback. It is either exemplary quotes from pieces of feedback you offered that struck me as emblematic of some other things folks collectively had to say, or common themes that ran throughout. And I put them in the order of the 5 questions you were asked to respond to. So I'm not going to read them to you, but I want to hit some of the high points that struck me on each of the slides because I think it was super valuable for me to read all of your feedback, but also valuable to try to distill down what the commonalities were. So under the questions around diverse historical and cultural perspectives, advancing anti-racist thinking or reinforcing racist thinking, a couple of big things came out. One was this notion of sanitized or neutral language, specifically as it related to the actions of white people and positions the standards take on issues of social justice. Conversely, there were lots of comments about the lack of agency, and one person phrased it as lack of a seat at the table for Black folks and other people of color in the standards, that oftentimes individuals who were not white are treated as the oppressed And there were very few opportunities in which those folks were given agency in the standards as agents of their own change, agents of their own liberation. Lots of concern about some of the guiding philosophies at the start of the standards, including this quote from someone around the myth of the nation's founding principles versus how it's been lived out. A lack of mention of white supremacist culture and thinking. Lots of folks talked about the treatment of slavery in the standards, both the shallowness of it, so where it began to get detailed versus where it could have started earlier in the grades, as well as a lack of discussion about the way slavery permeated all sorts of decisions in our early governance, the history of our country, the basis of the economic systems of the founding of the nation, etc. And then actually echoing what Sally just raised, this need for a more consistent global context and perspective in all grade levels. Lots of good questions around starting with America first and really giving students an America-centric view of all of the stories of history and geography that came next. On civic engagement, lots of thoughts here around specific wording that is or isn't in the standards. Going back again to some of the themes from the first question, making sure that studying democratic principles doesn't obscure inequities in history. Some suggestions about other state standards we should look at, specifically Massachusetts. And then, as we talked about cognitive lift, folks had lots of thoughts about places where the cognitive lift could be raised, or places where the content was really too dense for the amount of time it was offered in the standards. So I put these pieces of feedback, and again, you all have this deck, so I do encourage you to read it more carefully as well as to read all the feedback. But folks suggested that we need to do a lot more talking to students about race, racism, and the way race plays a part in both our story and global perspective earlier, given what we know about children's biases, ideas, and racial identities hardening very early on in childhood. Talk about when we should begin to talk about the middle passage in slavery, the notion that the fourth grade standards talk a lot about exploration, but gloss over the link that that has and the overlapping lines with the middle passage. Thinking about how we talk about justice and oppression throughout the standards, including in the early grades. Folks wondered about the amount of content packed into grades 4 and 5 and the way we think about heroism as we teach. Lots of folks had critiques about 6th grade, specifically the deep focus on geography, but the lack of connection to any other global perspectives. And then the amount of stuff that was held until high school that really could have been asked earlier, or the amount of content we saved for high school that we fail to explore with children in younger grades. And if we had explored that content earlier, could we think about going deeper with students in high school? I really loved the last quote, and that's why I pulled it out in particular. I'm not at all concerned about cognitive load. DC kids are perfectly capable of handling this rich content. And while I don't think that was an acceptance of, yes, every grade has the perfect amount of standards, I think it's an important point for all of us to remember that, like, as we seek to have rigorous standards, we want to make sure that we balance out load and rigor. Last two questions folks had. Thought about sequencing and building knowledge. This idea someone offered I thought was intriguing about working backwards through history so that we don't lose the things that are often jammed into the last few months of a course year. Another suggestion of looking at other state standards. New Jersey was offered up as another model. Thinking about when to teach early civilizations and how that might help advance global perspectives. And then ways we tie the past to the present, because that seems to be a common theme in your feedback around the fact that a lot of standards seem to stand wholly alone, as though nothing happened until this thing we're teaching them about in history, and no effort to draw those long arcs that we talked about in our first meeting. Your last piece of feedback were, what are your questions? And you had a lot of them. A couple folks mentioned the C3 framework, so we'll talk more about that in our next steps today. A lot of you asked about specific pieces of content. Economic principles was one that came up a couple of times. Thinking about depth versus breadth. Again, this question about America First. And then how do we think about this with thematic-based curriculum? I want to say one more thing about that before we shift into you in small groups talking through some of this feedback. A lot of you voiced an interest the first meeting in a more thematic approach to teaching history. And I was interested in that a lot of our one-on-one conversations raised an equal amount of concerns about teaching thematically as you had about the excitement for teaching thematically. And a few pieces of concern that came up were, how do we make sure that things don't lose their home? That if we say, well, that's going to be part of a theme that crosses across all the grades, that we don't lose a specific place for that standard, that topic to be taught at least once in its home, while also being tied through a theme. Another point folks raised that I think came up a lot in the tensions we all just heard around guiding principles and specificity is this question of, we can write the standards and then people write curriculum and it may or may not hit the standards in all the ways we want it to. And then teachers teach the curriculum and they may or may not teach the curriculum in a way that aligns with the standards. So I think one thing I hope we'll keep in mind as we grapple with these questions is our locus of control. We only have control over these guiding principles and whether or not we think they have shown up in the standards when we review them and give feedback. I am a control freak, so it bothers me immensely that that is the limit of our locus of control, but I think it's one that we have to keep in mind as we go through. Think about how to build the best set of standards we can to equip LEAs with the best information to write the best curriculum and prepare their teachers to teach well. Okay, with that in mind, I've talked at you a lot. I want to give you time to break out into small groups. We're going to do something, and Karen Lee, I thank you for this good suggestion. We're going to do 3 rounds of group interaction. You're going to be in breakout groups, randomly sorted, for about 10 minutes. I'd ask you to introduce yourself again, to discuss themes that you heard in the feedback of the standards or read through on the slides. And then with your group, try to put some words to paper. Alex put a link in the chat. This is a live Google Doc. We're going to ask you in your small groups to start to put things down that seem to be guiding principles or emerging themes that are coming up for you, so that we start to crowdsource some of this stuff we've been talking about in the abstract. Between each of your 3 rounds, we'll come back to the main room and ask one group to share out something that came up in their conversation so that we start to get windows into your conversations. And then at the end, we'll come back as a full group and have a more thorough share out and return to that conversation about guiding principles. Any questions before John Paul sends you all to breakout rooms? You will see state board folks popping in. Our role is purely as observers. We're not going to speak. If you have a specific question, you can let us know, but otherwise we're just flies on the wall listening as you all talk to one another. All right, can everyone access the Google Doc? All right, John Paul, without further ado, I think we are sending folks into their first session, and I'll keep watch on our time, and we'll see folks in about 10 minutes.
Staff at OSSE.
Hey, Justin. I'm Scott Abbots. I'm the Director of Social Studies for DC Public Schools. So former social studies teacher and instructional coach.
I'm Becca Schubeiler. I'm at DC International. I also coach new social studies teachers.
Hi, my name is Melanie Holmes. I teach 6th grade world geography, and I'm also an instructional coach at the school.
I'm Mike Stevens. I'm the Director of Social Studies for Friendship.
Becca, where do you coach new social studies teachers, or through what do you coach?
Through an alternative start program.
Oh, which program is it?
The Harvard Teacher Fellows.
Harvard Teacher Fellows?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It's
Is
like
it
their in-house teach. It's their in-house Teach for America, and it's like they have residencies across the country, so it's virtual.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, I was gonna say, is it virtual? But I was like, yeah, of course it's virtual right now anyway.
But it's been virtual for years, so.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Well, do you guys have some thoughts about trends that we were hearing about guiding principles?
I mean, this is a very obvious theme, but just to get the conversation started, I think that was definitely one theme I saw was just a desire of, what you could call hard history, right? Of not giving kids, especially even starting at the early grades, like a very sanitized, warm, feel good, pumping patriotism idea into the standards.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what breakout room are we? What number?
We're 3. I just.
Oh, somebody's
gave
having
us a little section.
Sweet.
I mean, I think it's important, one, especially as instructional practitioners, to think about like our goal is like in the themes that I hear, I hear a lot of, for a lack of a better word, sort of a tendency to like create kids in my own image a little bit, to create thinkers in my own image, like a little bit. I think I'm getting a little pushback.
Yeah, it's a good little feedback, at least on mine.
So it's, it's important. I think it's important for the full group to think, it's not our goal to indoctrinate kids. It's our goal to teach kids. And like, if you want to be proud of your country, you can be proud of your country. It should be grounded in something. Like, what I want you to know is that there's a long history and there's a long theme, and that our country has done good things and not so good things, right? And I want you to be able to access text and access resources to make an informed viewpoint on these issues yourself. Like, I just really sort of challenge everybody in the room to think about, like, what do we want kids to do, and what do we want them to understand that they have the freedom to do? And because I think that's what gives the social studies their inherent power. So I think my antennas sort of like stick up when I hear things like, like, I think it's fun to understand as a theme, these themes through American history about nationalism and patriotism, right? But like, I get a little squirmy when we sort of hear like pushing kids to one direction of the spectrum rather than another. Like, what I want kids to do is to be able to think for themselves and have access to resources, and be able to access those resources to make informed decisions and to participate in the democracy, right? So I think that's just like it's a balancing act. It's a hard thing we have to do as teachers all the time. So.
John Paul just popping in.
What are other themes emerging that people can see from the explicit feedback provided?
We want to stay in the lane of the first one, since that's kind of where we are, rather like the first question that was about sort of anti-racist, justice focused, like rather than trying to tackle all.
Ideas about oppression, more
I liked how, I think Jessica mentioned the word protest, but also not just depression, but like the response to it. I guess like that's what comes to my mind is like people want more. I like how I think Justin said like less like patriotism and like America is so great, but just like the honest truth about it, and then people can make up their own minds about the country.
Yeah.
Like I feel
But you know, I guess I would just say like I wonder what some of those things are. I mean, I see a lot of questions, but I don't see a lot of specific examples of what could be added. I see like a lot of what's missing, or this could have been done earlier, but I'm wondering what content people think could be added.
So if I could just, I know I'm supposed to be observing, but I would also note that one of the things that we can task the state board staff with is finding some of those examples if the advisory committee says we need examples of X, Y, and Z. So we don't need to get fixated on that part of it. I can ask my staff to do some of that work.
Okay.
I mean,
I guess what I was like, I'm sure we have ideas about what the content we would like to add into it could be. I just don't see it now.
Yeah, Melanie, I can give you like one example because so having worked on leading the first grade and third grade stuff this summer, the first grade especially, I will tell you, it's like, I'm just like, please tell me something specific that I can write a curriculum to. Like, you know, it's just very like ephemeral. It's like holidays and symbols and
right.
There's like this one unit in first grade, this one section of the standards, it's about the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was like, oh, why would you put that in first grade? But when you're actually writing curriculum and then actually things to it, like that is like my favorite part now because there's something you can actually grasp onto. And so like when I'm like talking to my own kids and like my daughter just finished first grade, that was the stuff that she liked the best. So like, you know, there's some problems with the core knowledge approach from like, I think a balancing anti-racism perspective. But I do think that the idea that comes from that core knowledge program around like putting like meaty content about civilizations and building world knowledge in those early grades, I think that is something that feels a little bit missing to me right now, that I would love to see as we're going forward.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Yeah, that really stood out to me as I was reading it. Like, I felt like I read the same standards like 7 times, and then we got into like 4th grade, and all of a sudden I was like, American history, let's go. I don't teach elementary schoolers, but and I'm writing random things down in our undergroup breakout room 3. I guess we have a minute and a half left. If I don't know if this captures what we meant or if other people had thoughts they wanted to get out.
Well, I know that one of the things that the last thing I guess we were supposed to do, our third task, was to maybe start to identify a guiding principle. I'm wondering, does anyone have in the final minute and 15 an idea of something that could maybe turn into one? Because I'll say that the first through 4th, I had similar experiences reading it. You know, whenever I look at it, I feel the same way. What I do appreciate that they're trying to do, and I promise I'm going to get to this really succinctly, I do feel like there's an appreciative attempt in those early 4th grades of the concept of identity, which is something I see missing once we get into history on like 4th, 5th grade on. Then the student's role becomes very receptive and very passive, and I don't really hear any reference at all of the voice and agency. So I wonder if like anyone thinks that maybe something dealing with identity of the student and discovering their own and where that fits into history should be a guiding principle, or if people think I'm smart.
Well, I do think that identity is important, and I think that's one reason probably why people are mentioning people of color in here, because that is something that is largely missing. So I feel like if we added that explicitly, that would complement the suggestions of adding people of color and lacking agency, seat at the table, that type of thing.
That social studies should help students, you know, discover their identity.
Right.
And to Justin's earlier point, it's also sort of a national, you know, like it also your self-identity, but also the identity of your community and also the identity of your nation, both good and bad. Like,
yeah. Well, it's bringing to mind that phrase about like windows and mirrors. And I think You know, I think some like the teaching tolerance folks like talk about that phrase a lot of like thinking about like, do students see, you know, mirrors of their own identity reflected in the standards and the curriculum that they're studying,
Right.
as well as do they get windows into civilizations, societies, time periods, places that they don't know about, because that's important for them to get. And so sort of having those things come into maybe a little bit of a better balance.
All right, sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna.
Did we capture that?
I'm working on it.
You got the last word.
In a minute.
Hey, but the water's in the refrigerator.
We're going back to the
Too
main.
wordy for a guiding principle, but it's got the ideas in there.
So
We'll make it pretty later.
Heading back to the main room in the next, 30 to 45 seconds. So, thanks everyone.
That's cool. Thank you. Thank you, Becca, for writing things down.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Yes, in our 30 seconds while we look at each other, you mentioned the teaching tolerance.
Break out. I love.
In theory, your colleagues will join us back here momentarily. Gotta love technological experiments.
Hi.
All right, so I am very excited that that worked almost exactly as planned. Before I hear from one group, I want to just make sure everyone learns the thing that Elizabeth Richardson called out I learned when she taught where to find it. So at the top of your screen in your breakout room will be the number of your breakout group. Looks like most folks figured that out. I was slow to the party. And there's a timer that tells you how much time you have left on your conversation. So I'd encourage you, after you do your round of introductions, just to deputize someone to keep an eye on the timer so that you know when your conversation is wrapping up, and then we'll all get warped back here to the main room. Before we go into our second groups, I'd love to hear from a group. Is there a volunteer who may want to share what you talked about and what came up in your conversation?
I'll go first since we were group one. Jessica, I know this is boring to you because you just sat in on it, but we spent a lot of time talking about kind of the lack of instruction around civic values. And yeah, and we just saw a vacuum there in terms of providing students explicit instruction in what civic values and civic engagement would look like. We also talked a lot about like where are the opportunities for us to explore kind of the hypocrisies in terms of us living up to our democratic principles and the times we have failed to do that. So where can that live? That does not live in the existing standards, and where can that live or be stated in the guiding principles?
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Lamar, you also raised your hand. What did your group talk about?
So our group, our discussion kind of fell into two different categories. The first one being the idea of American exceptionalism is kind of introduced very early on, because America is set as the standard culture from which all students make comparisons according to the standards, and it makes it more difficult to develop a broader global perspective and really see why these other countries, continents, or what have you are important in the overall historical narrative. So we didn't quite finish writing down all of our ideas because we were just so in the weeds of saying things out loud, but we definitely want to make more of a focus on making sure that students get introduced, or at least they have some legitimate exposure to other nations besides America earlier on in their educational career, because that just makes it easier for them to develop a stronger sense of curiosity for other cultures and really see how these things shake out outside of just America. And the second thing that we focused on was some of the language that was used in the standards. Someone mentioned using Bloom's taxonomy verbs so that the standards are more actionable beyond students will discuss or think about or share. Those are all kind of surface level understandings, where if we're going for Bloom's taxonomy, the ultimate goal is synthesis.
We have about another minute before we have to head into our next group. So it looks like there's so many good thoughts in the Google group. Anyone else want to share from either of the other two groups? Daniel?
So we had similar discussions in our group. One thing that came up was, I think like the other group said, embedding a lot of the content in a global perspective early on from the beginning. Better opportunities for vertical alignment and addressing intersectionality also in a lot of these concepts. And then also exploring some of these concepts like social justice movements from perspectives outside of just race, but also gender and sexual orientation and such. Oh, and looking at the lives of everyday people rather than just people in power.
Yeah, that was a really good piece of feedback some folks put into the Google Doc as the Google form as well. This notion of how we really get a sense of history if all we study are sort of the heroic figures. And it's taking me far longer than I like to admit that I'm reading it, but I finally got to reading The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration. And I'm thoroughly engrossed in these lives of quite ordinary people who were emblematic of this period of history that is so dispersed that it's often hard to encapsulate. And I think a lot about, man, if only I had taught my students in this way about this period of time and how much it comes to life in seeing the lives of ordinary people. John Paul tells me we are ready. So we're headed you off into your next round of conversation. Again, just a quick round of introductions and then back at the conversation. You'll see a spot in round two for round 2 notes in the Google Doc. See you all in about 10 minutes.
I'm Daniel Espinas. I'm a 5th grade special ed teacher at Bancroft Elementary School.
Hey, I'm Justin Tuley. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff at OSSE.
Hello, everyone. My name is Reggie Williams. I'm a social studies teacher at Banneker Academic High School.
I'm Laura Fuchs. I teach social studies at H.D. Woodson High School.
I'm Fadal Moore. Both my parents went to Woodson, actually. I'm Fadal Moore. I am a former social studies teacher in Baltimore and DC, and currently a master's student studying public policy and education reform.
I'm Molly. I'm an instructional guide at Tourist Public Charter School. I support the elementary schools.
So does anybody want to be a note taker?
I'm happy to notes.
Okay.
Got it. We're 3, right? Yeah.
So would people like to continue discussing kind of themes that they saw in the feedback, or do we want to kind of shift into guiding principles and some recommendations there?
I think whatever comes naturally makes sense. Some things might fall under both of those umbrellas. I thought something I thought was pretty interesting, something I was thinking about and that I saw was mentioned by other folks was like this, the necessity of connecting the past to the present. I think that's something like in social studies classes is often a suggestion, and it's like it happens depending on who the social studies teacher is. But I think that is something that needs to be normalized, to be happening in every classroom, especially if we're talking about anti-racist thinking. Like if we're teaching about the stories of folks who communities who are like very unfamiliar with them, they may be very one and done with like some of these oppressions, and they think, oh, that was awful that happened in 1955. I'm so glad they don't have to deal with that now. I think it would be very pertinent, right, for people to have to make those connections to 2020 or 2025 or whatever year it is, to explain like how what we saw in X year affects today. And I think that's like a very important thing for all students to be able to do. And it even like works together with like the civic engagement stuff and everything. Is just, I just think it's like just too important to fall by the wayside and to be a teacher by teacher phenomenon.
I definitely agree. It's a guiding, kind of like, that's a guiding principle. I think the question kind of becomes, right, how do you write that in, right? So like, for example, this past year, luck, it's not luck for the people involved, but Iran happened to fall when I was about to do a week-long unit of Iran. Things were kicking off between the United States, right? So like, it was just immediate. Every breaking news story, the kids were like, what? We're learning about the Shah, and there it is. So like, that just happened to happen. And it's not that there wouldn't have been like current stuff we could have talked about, but like sometimes I think the ability to like, even providing that as a guiding principle to districts and to teachers, like you should be able to kind of shift sometimes, like if it allows to like that happened, that like it just happened that we were about to study that while it was going down. But like, what if it had been the next week? Maybe I could have bumped it up a week, right? Like something like that provides that direction.
Just to add to what you're saying, Laura, I've had a similar experience. I remember I was teaching the 10th grade course in 2016, and I was going over like the rise of like fascist empires, and the students just naturally just gravitated so much to it because of some of the language and the elections that we ended up spending a little bit more time on it. So I wonder if that's not necessarily a guiding principle of the standards, but a guiding principle of implementing the standards. That as you implement the standards, that teachers and LEAs should have the freedom and the leeway to maybe shift so that some of these current events that are happening, that connectivity can be really brought about by the teacher. If that makes any sense.
I mean, I think it's I think you're trying to raise a really interesting balance, which is how much flexibility do you want to give to instructors, right? Is that if you want instructors to say, all right, like for what I care about, like history is great, right? You could spend people spend their entire lives on small periods of history, and they, write books about them and things. Like, you'll never learn all of history. I don't know why we try in the social studies to teach all of history in these like crazy survey courses, right? But like what I think is good teaching, and what I see good teaching is like, how are students being able to engage text? How are they being able to engage primary sources? How are they, what analytical tools are they using? Not only, like, are they building those chops so then they can go out later on and access historical artifacts, go to a museum and appreciate, read an article, a current events article, and have some sort of like background knowledge to go and use some research skills. I think that's what's that's what's powerful, right? Is like, would I lose sleep at night if a kid didn't get some minute period of history somewhere? No. But would I lose sleep at night if like no kid was able to attack a primary source document? Yeah, that's not good. That's not right. Or know the difference between a primary or a secondary source, or could assess whether something was a credible source or not. Like, yeah, that would probably keep me up at night.
Justin, you really had my brain going as you were talking. I wonder if you're talking about survey courses, and this is just an idea. I wonder if, especially in the high school years, it's important to have the courses have more flexibility. So just hear me out. What if the surveying courses are more like in the middle school years, so that you can have more content rich specific that might just be a specific time period or a specific region that are in high school years, and that kind of gives teachers the flexibility to choose those courses, for the students or LEAs to choose those courses, so that you're not necessarily doing these big surveys in the higher years, and you're able to pick something that might be more relevant to what's going on currently as well. That's kind of
back a little bit, because I think the reason you can read a primary source is because you know content and context. And I don't mean you have to memorize stuff or like know every minute detail. And I do agree that the standards as written are extremely detailed. If we were really trying to do to the letter, it wouldn't really work, right? And a lot of us don't do to the letter. We do broad pictures using many of the letters in our broad pictures that we're painting. But I would push back, and maybe it's just the world history teacher in me, but what I do find, right, is when people start to have choices, one, districts east of the river don't really get choices, we get limitations. We lose resources. So that's one thing. Every time I've seen the word flexibility thrown out, it just means my school's gonna lose out on stuff, and we're gonna get reduced to kind of an assumption of what students might be interested in. And then two, just, I think like diving in deep is for college, is for more like, this is your chance to learn about certain things, to establish that foundation. And while I do think it is too detailed, it is too specific, and if we freed it up a bit within the confines that are already there, that could then provide teachers more flexibility. But a lot of that is up to implementation, right? One school can let me have all the flexibility in the world and another school might not. The standards are the same. Right? Like right now, I just happen to give myself flexibility on the standards. I follow the standards, not the curriculum. So just a thought there. I do think that, you know, if you can allow entire continents to disappear when you start using the word like flexibility. Like I just know from my own high school experience, we ended up with like Europe and South America. Can't really explain why, but those were the two continents that my high school, when given like area studies, that's what we had, kind of based on teachers' interests. And so teachers weren't forced to push themselves and learn more. And like, I'll be honest, at Woodson, if I wasn't there, it'd be US history all day, every day, maybe some Euro, because that no one else has a specialty anywhere else. And so they'd go with what they're comfortable with in the name of flexibility. So I do think we just have to be careful. You know, it's not that diving deep isn't good, it is, but how do you write those in a way that doesn't mean that certain schools start shrinking in what they can offer due to the word flexible?
I would appreciate that feedback, Laura. And go ahead, Fidel. I'm sorry.
No, you good, man.
I appreciate it because I feel like me particularly, even in the spaces I've been, because I've been able, just my who-ness and what my focuses are, allows me to kind of do some of the similar work that you described that you do. But now as I listen to you, I can see how that flexible, quote unquote, can be very limiting. So I definitely hear you on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say the
We're about to get back, hurry.
Oh, but never mind. It's too long. Maybe I'll write it.
And off to cyberspace. Right? Oh, no, maybe not.
Yeah.
Oh, now 1 minute. I thought that was like the end of it.
It's all good.
I'm hearing a lot of breadth versus depth discussion.
I mean, that is the eternal battle, right?
I think Laura's right. I think there's a balance, right? I think like these survey courses, it should hit key periods. Like I don't think American history should be taught without Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Gilded Age, right? But Jesus, the depth that it goes through on civil rights to name out specific, like, whew, I couldn't do it. Like, who could do it? And it would be very low Bloom's defined type stuff anyway, and that doesn't serve anybody, right? So it's like,
right.
I mean, knowing a date is memorization, and like that's.
You're back. So another fantastic conversation I got to be fly on the wall for, but I would love to hear from others. So folks we didn't hear from last time who'd like to share out for their group this time.
Well, my group and Alex did a really good job of bringing this point to light. We talked about the experiences of oppressed groups of people in the United States and how those experiences are often excluded. But then we also open it up to how the experiences of oppressed people around the world are often excluded. And oftentimes it's not explicit about how different groups of people, whether they're Native Americans, Black people, like how was it that they became oppressed? Who's responsible for it? Alex also mentioned, I think one thing that we could tie into that is how has that historic oppression become relevant to today? So that's what we talked about, and I think group 1.
Oh, bouncing off of that, we our group started, I don't know what number we were, but my group sort of talked about that, where I talked about that too. Just talking about how, as a student who's currently in school in DCPS, how the first thing I can remember learning about my history is slavery, and how that's not where it started. That's not where everything started. So just thinking about how things are taught can affect people's self-image and self-awareness about themselves. When the first thing, when you think that you started as a slave, how do you go about approaching your life? How do you go about approaching school? Does that make you angry? So like, we just got to think about stuff like that. So I definitely agree with the oppressed people. How are we approaching teaching their history?
Yeah, that feels like it's going to impact our conversations about sequencing and whether we have any guiding principles, any recommendations for the writing committee about sequencing. We have another couple minutes, so let's hear from another group. Other thoughts? How is it going trying to put some of this into writing?
Well, we didn't try to put into writing, but I think we did have success in terms of Emily shared some work that she's been doing, looking at countries around the world and how and described the fact that many of them have this sort of civics engagement and sort of dispositions of citizenship as a separate, as really separate entirely from their social studies standards. Now, we wouldn't have to go there, but it would seem that by recognizing that there is a body of content that there is, that is not to be confused sort of with civics as history, but civics as engagement and civics as a set of sort of dispositions. She said it actually is a part in Ireland of personal development work. But anyway, I think that opened for all of us the possibility that you could even imagine a whole separate strand, if that's a term that we may or may not end up adopting, but that there would be, or a theme or what have you, related to dispositions of citizenship that would, really give us a place to build that out robustly, even with all of the other content.
Yeah. Any other comments from this latest round on thoughts, putting ideas into themes, something that stands out for you from your discussion? All right, folks are clearly very deeply in their thinking on this. John Paul, are we ready for our last round of groups?
I have one thing to suggest.
Sure, Justin.
I think in the conversations that I've heard is just like, I think it's important to think about, like, I think that there's a balancing act, right? Like, think about the principles you're trying to balance, right? We had a very interesting conversation in our group about, teacher flexibility versus specificity of certain things in history, right? And what is too much and too little. Like, I think that those are the types of tensions that folks are going to have to consider and give us some clarity and thought on, right? Like, I think this issue around this really thoughtful consideration about the lens of history, like whose history gets told and who's doesn't, is a very powerful theme, right? And like, having that perspective, I think, is what we want our students to take away, right? Is like, yeah, let's talk about this period in history, but let's think about someone else's perspective. Like, what was it like to be a Black kid that couldn't go to a white school? What is it like that? Those are historical tools, and that's like very powerful to use. So just think about what we want kids to do, be able to do as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Justin. All right, we're gonna go into one more round. So you have one more different group. You might have some of the same folks, but hopefully you'll be with mostly new folks. And I'll see you all back here in 10 minutes, and we'll wrap up and come back to our original conversation around the right level of the guiding principles.
Back again.
All right. All three.
Oh, Alyssa too.
Yeah, this group looks familiar.
Sorry, that's my issue with trying to make a random group.
No worries. Well, I'm Elizabeth Worden. You can call me Lizzie. I'm an associate professor at American University. I work on citizenship and civic education for almost 2 decades. I study countries outside of the US. So Barbara was giving the examples that I was providing for places where citizenship education is not tied to history, that they treat it as something standalone, and avoids a lot of the problems and dilution that happens when civics is often incorporated into teaching history.
Laura Fuchs, I teach at HD Woodson, past decade plus a few.
Sally Schwartz with Globalized DC, an organization.
Shalina Warren, Dunbar High School. Oh yeah, that's it.
I'm Alyssa Richardson. I'm a rising junior at Duke Ellington School of the Arts.
Nick Ojeda, Duke Ellington School of the Arts. Shouts out to Miss Fuchs and Miss Warren and Miss Schwartz. We've all worked together in one capacity or another.
So we're just doing the conversation again.
We were really talking. I've been with Elizabeth in the past 2 weeks. Got all 3 of them, but we really echoed the whole civic action component. And then we had last week. Our discussion actually kind of got cut off when it was in a good point. Like we were trying to determine whether or not the civic action components would be standalone, or would you incorporate them in the themes? And then it's like what are things you're going to be requiring them to do? And I gave an example of, like, okay, yeah, let's just use something very basic like registering to vote. But then we're like, well, okay, are we going to register? Or is that really what we're going to ask? Are we going to be asking kids to take particular types of actions, or is it going to be more like, no, that this is what you do in certain, situations or contexts? So then it got cut off.
I guess, like, to me, right, this is someone whose students do a lot of actions that DCBS does not like. I think to me, it should be organic, and it should be based on kind of organizing principles. Like, you should be teaching the principles of action and how to organize and take collective action or individual action, different forms of action. And be ideally, at least for me, I like integrating it because you use history as the guide. Like, here's all these people who've done all these things. Here's all these regular, kind of rank and filer types who step up and make history, make change, both locally and globally. So kind of teaching those principles versus like these kind of little one-offs, like write a letter to the mayor. Like, if you want to, great, but like you should be able to design the tactics for your goal, and you should learn like how to select a target, how to design your tactics, how to by digesting how others have done it when you're teaching those things. So I'd integrate it and base it on principles so that you're not tasking people, but they could say, oh, well, I want to register to vote because voting's the key to this kind of power. And so I want to register people. And then they come up with it themselves and carry it out. Authentic, right? Like, not
Yeah, I think also our point that we were talking about with Nick is like, so many things need to be explicit. So we know that like the teachers who are part of this advisory group, like y'all are doing this already. You're making the connections for your students. It's coming through, but if they're not explicit, it's like a lottery. It depends on the teacher you get and who's going to do it that year. And like some teachers, citizenship might not be their thing. And we're also talking about like, Laura, you're giving like a really, like one example of like act as democratic action in writing a letter to your representative, but we've also been talking about, like with Nick, his background in peace studies is like all the ways of being in a democratic society that's not explicit. Tolerance, conflict resolution, stuff like other places do this. They have standards around this, around dispositions or learning outcomes or goals. And like, why don't we have that explicit? Why are we relying on like the goodness of teachers who are socially justice minded to make these connections, or the LEAs? And the same with Sally's point about the global, like I can't believe there's global citizenship is not even mentioned in the standards. And I'm like, it's just going to be up to the the whim of the LEAs to put that in. And that's not fair and that's not consistent. So I feel strongly about this.
This is John Paul. I just want to weigh in really quickly to note that someone should be taking notes.
Oh.
Because this is all really good stuff that I really care about too. And I want to make sure that it's part of the conversation.
Anyone good at multitasking of doing this?
So, and I recognize so this is John Paul again. I'm not supposed to be part of these conversations, but I can't help myself sometimes. I would also so I have not had a student in my breakout group yet. So I would love to hear from Alyssa, like what her perspective is on the standards and like what this process is and what would be good for her to hear. And if she's still there.
I'll take notes while we're listening to Alyssa.
Thanks.
Okay. I don't really know much about like the civil side of like this type of stuff because I haven't done like U.S. history yet or anything. The only history that we have in that I've had in high school so far is world history. So I'm getting to that this year. So I'm sort of just listening. But I was participating in the other breakout rooms, John Paul.
So there's something that's related to all this that I felt was really missing when I read through the standards, and that had to do with that sort of front material. And this is the question of why we teach social studies. It seemed to me that the purpose for this set of standards was the ones that are currently in existence is that to be a good citizen of the United States, you need to know this stuff. And you need to know how to sing the Star Spangled Banner, which appeared at each grade level, I think, for 4 years. I don't think that's why we should be teaching social studies. And I don't think that's what this conversation is about. So I think in terms of a guiding principle, we really need to say what we're trying to, what we're trying to do with these standards, which is, in my mind, to help individuals see their place in society, in their community, in their country, in the world, and to give them the tools and the skills and the mindsets to be active participants and change the world. That's very different from what is in the guiding principles in that first, in the current set of standards. So I think any kind of guiding principles should include something about what we think the purpose of all this teaching is about.
I don't know if you read my comment. I had that in the, in the Google Doc. I said, we might want to have a conversation where we have shared norms about what is the purpose of teaching history, and like what's the purpose of teaching the various strands. So I agree with you.
I definitely agree. I'm so worried that a lot of this is just going to mean the content gets driven from the standards, and I just can't sit by and let that happen without pushing back, I guess, just because I see kind of the context that we are operating in, right, policy-wise. The words like flexibility. And flexibility just means students lose rights. At least east of the river they do in DC. So like we know that flexibility can mean like driving down what is offered, limiting what is offered, concentrating what is offered to what people are comfortable teaching. And a lot of people are not comfortable with global history. Like, especially in DC, at least in my school, we're very US history and government focused in terms of just people's backgrounds and what they like to teach. And then very Euro-centered in their history. And that's just happenstance, right? People come and go. But I think that, you know, while we want to limit and we don't want it to be as broad as it is now, we can't lose content in the name of skills. And I'm not saying anyone's advocating for that. I'm just saying when we start pushing certain things, we always have to try to see, like, how can we balance all these different needs that we're trying to achieve without just losing content. Because I am worried that certain continents are just going to drop off the map with this. Like, you know, this is what happens when we start to try to broaden and broaden. It really ends up narrowing in a lot of ways. So how to balance.
Laura, one of the things that I wrote in a couple different places was that for me, and I may be the only one in this situation, I need some clarity on the interplay between the standards and the curriculum in the real world. When I read the world history standards, I remembered you saying, I love teaching world history. And when I read those standards, I felt like, I'm so glad I don't have to teach this world history, because it just seems so broad and narrow. I mean, inch deep, mile wide. So I hope that there's a time for me to understand, like, how specific the standards should be and where the pushback is. Like, that for me is.
Well, and like, what does it mean to teach a standard, right? Do all my kids literally need to do every task that's listed there? No, they do not. Because that's way too much. Like, you can't do it. Like, even
way too much.
Like, it's too much. But also, right, if you just take Turkey out of the standards, kids will not learn about Turkey. Period, right? Like, it's gone. Like, any reference, right, to it. And like, so it's like, how do we, especially with a global survey course, try to balance that we can't cover everything, we shouldn't, but also that the second it's gone, it's gone. And some kids, this might be their only opportunity to learn about it. If they're not going to go, like, even if they just decide to major in business when they go on to college, right? They just might not be doing this again, which, you know, fair to them. But like, I don't know. It's just, it's a lot. It's, you know, and we just have to be really careful because.
Here we go.
We got warped right in the middle of Melanie about to say something. So Melanie, I'm sorry. We were like, time was
no. No, you're fine. But to me though, that's very helpful because I didn't, you know, I didn't know if we have to keep 6th grade world geography, 7th grade ancient civilizations, 8th grade was history, 9th grade world 1, 10th grade world 2, 11th. You know, I didn't know if like that was a part of the revision, and are we trying to just change, create guiding principles that fit those parameters, but just maybe tighten them up, or if that was something that was up for discussion as well.
Yeah, I think we make folks like Scott Abbott and Mike Stevens a little nervous when we talk about rewriting everything in its entirety as curriculum focused folks, but I also think they're both up for the challenge of us giving them something new to work with. So I'm going to jump back into our slide deck for a second to some slightly revised reflection questions from the ones that appeared in your earlier draft of the deck. Because I'd asked basically earlier today, what are some key themes? What questions do you have? But for me, the one I'm really interested in hearing, though certainly happy to hear any of the three, is where is your thinking on guiding principles after your discussions with your group? We started our time together tonight trying to get our head around what a guiding principle could include or should not include. Where's your thinking now? So feel free to put it in the chat or raise hands in terms of giving some feedback.
So Jessica, this is Mike Stevens. One thing I'll say really quickly, my thought at the beginning was that I could see this happening, and I think I noticed it a couple of times during the conversations where when we're talking about guiding principles, sometimes I hear us talking about principles that we want to guide the creation of the curriculum. And other times I hear us talk about principles we want to ascribe within students and what they get out of social studies curriculum. And I think that those are important distinctions. So I think at some point, maybe some clear definition would be helpful.
Yeah, can you repeat that, Mike? I just want to make sure I understand the distinction you're bringing up.
So sometimes like I hear us talking with language of like, so the guiding principles should include this, this, and this to help with the curriculum. But then at other times I hear us say things in groups in conversation that, you know, are, well, I think the guiding principles are really important so that students will find their identity within the curriculum, or that students will ascribe the value of social action.
So for who are the guiding principles? Like, are the guiding principles targeted at what we want for students or for what we want for the standards?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
I feel like for me, the guiding principles are, I'm just, like, I don't know, maybe I feel a little nervous because I'm wondering, like, if we're broad in our writing of them. I guess it goes back to what we were saying earlier, like, how are we going to ensure what we want is written into the standards and you know, in a way that this revision process has been worthwhile.
Yep. I will go back to a statement I made earlier, which is, you know, I joked around and called myself a control freak, but I do think it's helpful to think about sort of where your level of control is. And so the State Board of Education is an advisory body. That is our role. We advise.
Okay.
We don't implement. And so this advisory committee is that same role. We advise. We offer advice on what we want to be different. Now, what we do get to do from this committee is we get to advise and then review draft products and finished products against our advice to say either, yes, you met our advice, or no, you didn't meet our advice. And because the state board is adopting the guiding principles and then having the approval authority for the standards, you all wield a significant amount of influence there in saying, this is what we want to see, state board. State board says, great, OSSE, here's what we want to see. If OSSE brings us back standards that don't look like that, they're, you know, that's where the check is, to be able to say, these standards do not meet what we asked for. But I do think getting the level of this guiding principle just right, the sort of Goldilocks problem. We don't want to be too specific. We don't want to be too generic. We have to be just right in order to give standards writers something they can work with. What else are folks thinking about the guiding principles? We have time for about 2 more comments before we.
I was just going to jump in really quick with the follow-up of, I wonder if it's creating a document that's like, these are our guiding principles. Here's what they should look like, and here's what they don't look like. And the don't look like is an example from the current standards, and then sort of the do look like is more of the like, this is where we're heading, so that there is place for that critique to be seen and visible for the writers who are writing them.
I like that idea. Yeah, exemplars and not exemplars. Other thoughts?
This is Laura. I know I talk too much. I'll keep it short. Just, we can't forget implementation in the context within which we're operating and who will be handed these documents. I think, you know, a lot of things are done with the best of intentions and can have really big unintended consequences. And so we just need to always be thinking about, even if we can't control what will happen on each stage, we do want to think about the advice we are giving and how that could be interpreted or willfully misinterpreted, used, or willfully misused.
It is important to get this right. Jessica, I like your point. Do you want to give it voice as well?
I'm sorry, I was shaking my head.
Oh, sorry.
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll just let the words stand on their own. All right. With that in mind, and knowing that we have about 8 minutes left together, it sounds like there are some continued evolution of thinking around what these guiding principles are and are not, what the right level will be to write the guiding principles at, how we can make sure we as a committee make plain our thinking to the folks who receive the guiding principles. There seems to be some support in the chat for this exemplar, non-exemplar idea that builds on the examples we talked about earlier. So here's what I'm proposing as our next steps so that we get ourselves a little closer to this work. We have 4 more meetings as a collective. Our next meeting is September the 8th. For that meeting, this is what I'd like to suggest as pre-work. I'd like to actually sort of clean up our Google Doc a little bit so that we put together common themes that came up in there. We'll leave it for you all to see so that we're not going to hide the ball. The beautiful thing about a guiding document, a Google document, is that you can see the edits. So I'll rearrange them so that we have some common guiding principles that come together. But I'd like to ask that you spend time between now and our September 8th meeting continuing to draft additional guiding principles in the document and feeding off of one another's additions to it. So again, it's going to remain a collaborative document. 2 things, and some of you may be hugely familiar with Google Docs, others may be quite new to them. I find it helpful to know about a few features of Google Docs. So you can type in and you can go and see what other people have typed by reviewing edits. But if you want to put something in to propose an idea for people, you can type it in as an editing function. At the top right-hand corner of the screen, there's a way to choose editing instead of writing. And I'm commenting, sorry, yeah, editing. And you can propose these things as suggestions in the document so that people can see that Jessica Sutter proposed this idea, and it'll appear in different colors as people add their ideas. So I might suggest that that's a way we can engage in the document together. Second thing is you can comment on people's things, just like you would with track changes and comments in a Word document, where you can highlight something and add a comment to the document so that folks can see if you want to have a question or a discussion about a particular topic that people are putting in, about a particular guiding principle. I'd like this to be a living document between now and September so that we continue our individual thinking on this, but also engage together. Second, we are going to be thinking about how to engage the public, and I'll follow up with a specific format for this, but we are going to need your help in thinking about how do we generate ideas for getting public feedback, assuming that we will continue to be under COVID conditions during that time of public feedback. So open public meetings at community centers are not likely to happen. How do we engage public and make sure that we don't just reach people who are able to access Zoom, folks who are comfortable filling out Google surveys? What are ways you can suggest that we deeply engage and get feedback from the public as these guiding principles come together, so that we can talk about them in September? So those are the 2 things I'm asking everyone to do. Continue adding to the guiding principles in the document, and then we'll send a Google form asking for your input on how to engage the public. I'll also amend that we're going to also ask for your thoughts on the technical committee and how you want to see the feedback loop between this advisory committee and the technical committee work. And Laura raised this point earlier, and then I think just sort of put a pin in it now. The idea of knowing that we're letting a little control go. We're handing over these guiding principles, and the people writing the standards have their own ideas about how they want to interpret it. So what's the right feedback loop to try and keep productive, ongoing communication, knowing that we're advisors and they're writers, but that there is still a back and forth? And then finally, your feedback in the standards Google form was great. In terms of other documents you wanted to see potentially included in our discussions. Lots of folks mentioned the C3 framework, so we're going to make sure everyone gets access to that and can think about reading that before next time, because we'll be talking in our next meeting a little bit about other frameworks that could influence our principles. And then other standards that people gave us as exemplars. Folks mentioned New Jersey, folks mentioned Massachusetts. I had a couple of other folks mention different states when we had individual discussions. We'll put all those in our shared Google folder so that folks can glance through those. I certainly don't expect anyone to read them as deeply as you read the DC standards, but take a look through them, see if there are things that appeal or ideas that come to mind to help influence our guiding principles. The last thing I'll say before I give a couple minutes for questions is a lot of you gave great people for us to hear from. And then we have the benefit of having some folks who worked on the last standards who are still in town, still working in education. So we're gonna pull together some outside speakers to come speak to us at the September meeting, pulling both from your suggestions on outside speakers as well as from folks who've had experience with the standards. So as we get closer to that meeting and we start reaching out to speakers, I may touch base with some of you about the recommendations and suggestions you offered just to follow up. We got 2 minutes left. Anything for the good of the order? Any questions outstanding? Anything you need closure on before we wrap tonight? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can interface this. All right. Then with 1 minute to spare, or Reggie, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, just something really quick. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the ability to talk in small groups today. I know there was a little bit of feedback of how it could possibly improve, but I really appreciated the teamwork and the level of conversation we were able to have at that small group level. I just wanted to call it out.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad to hear that. And I definitely take the feedback on how we should think about small groups in the future. I'm just excited we can meet in small groups. And so I'm definitely open to other ideas. Like I said, it was Karen Lee's suggestion from a PD she'd been part of to do multiple rounds with different folks. So if other folks have other facilitation tactics they'd like to see us use, please do send them my way. Very excited to continue trying new things with you all over the next couple months. Thanks for your time and for being deeply engaged. We'll save the chat so we make sure we have it and can record all the great things you all had to say. Have a wonderful Tuesday night and look out for emails from us for the Google Doc update and a Google form for your input.
Take care, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.